Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I noticed Nuxanora's next video the one he released within just about 2 or 3 hours after my last release on this podcast, was talking about real estate prices in New York and now graduating the title given to Twitch's favorite terrorist supporter Hassan Hamas Diddy Bin Laden Adolf Epstein Piker, adding Epstein to the only growing list of terms that Hassan is being associated with in his increasingly unhinged, blatant support of terrorism and incoherent political positioning. I'm not sure if the mention of Epstein was just Nuxanor throwing more shade onto Hassan in the realm of pedophilia, or if he was trying to potentially hint at Hassan's political power somehow originating from the Epstein files not being released. It's still too vague for me to consider potentially pushing for them to be released, especially since Trump is against it for reasons unclear to me. I found it strange how Elon was for them being released last I heard, and I'm also not sure if that was an attempt to push his own negative karma onto me somehow, or if it was actually just something he was doing to show some kind of supportive position towards me getting justice. I guess I'll just have to keep up with seeing what Nuxanor releases in order for me to get more insights if it ends up seeming relevant, since he's the only actually heavily political content creator that I actually watch. I did find it strange, however, that in the same video about New York real estate prices, Nuxanor also strangely suddenly decided to call Hassan his boy, because Hassan made substantial money off Amazon, apparently, and Amazon supports Israel. To my knowledge, both YouTube and Amazon have some kind of deal to support Israel, so technically, if you make money off either platform and have some kind of financial investments in either company, you technically support Israel indirectly, or something like that. Anyways, the point is that Nuxanor showed strange support in a sense for Hassan, in a manner I feel seems more like it was somehow coerced than an actually authentic expression of how he really wanted to talk about things. I also found coverage on real estate in New York a pretty strange topic in general for him to be discussing, and for both those strange occurrences to happen in the same video is exceptionally suspicious to me. Nuxanor seems to be somehow cucked because of his politics to the point where he's scared to give me attention publicly, although it seems it's by capitalist billionaires and not Hassan or any of the other terrorists or effective terrorist supporters that have been utmost aggressively, relentlessly, existentially assaulting me and conspiring to murder me. Well, the topic of real estate in New York suggests to me that the extremely aggressive, heavily politically involved exploitation of me by Kimmy and Jamie was so prominently, fully consciously, and intentionally occurring by Jamie, particularly in relation to exploiting Canadian government corruption that exploited me being on Ontario Works years ago to mess with real estate related prices in Canada is finally catching up with them. Me starting to expose everything is bringing attention to Jamie's egregious ignorance, arrogance, selfishness, and general neglect towards the world as a whole in the ultimate practical consequences of her decisions to suppress and sabotage me relentlessly that are backfiring because she's now having to deal with realizing herself being a substantial contributing factor to real estate in her own hometown being screwed up, substantially contributing to the overall decline of the entire area. From what Nuxanor is saying, and I'd say I believe it has indeed happened, although I haven't personally seen it, apparently Hassan has said Iran is pro-trans because if you're a homosexual male attracted to men, they force you to get sexual reassignment surgery or murder you. Well,
I myself am not attracted to men, so I'm not sure if they just consider me a weird, confused straight male or something like that. But regardless, that still means Iran is homophobic. Even if they accept being transgendered legitimately exists to some extent and aren't entirely against a transitioning process of some kind, aggressively disallowing gay men who identify as men who are attracted to other men still means they're very clearly discriminatory. And this is an opinion coming from someone who's entirely unaffected by even if the entire world adopted Iran's kind of ideology in that regard, since I wouldn't ever want to do anything sexual with men regardless. Like, I identify as transgendered, but I have no intention of ever cutting off the genitals I got from how I was born, mainly because I feel like I'd get the most pleasure from the sexual intimacy I want with women if I keep what I have down there. I feel like the only room anyone has at all to even begin to debate my being completely unbiased on this is if you're going to somehow show me proof that Kimmy was born with male genitals. And again, I'm pretty sure that's not the case. Because, to be clear, even if she was, I'd still want sexual intimacy with her all the same, because I evaluate and experience sexual attraction largely based on physical features as they're visible with someone even fully clothed in form-fitting clothing. But I'm certainly not disappointed that Kimmy was born with female genitals, at least as far as I'm aware. But none of that even really matters if Kimmy utterly refuses to actually embrace the kind of connection I've always wanted with her, and even refuses to directly communicate with me at all in general to even really possibly have a chance of that kind of connection ever even really being a possibility. Spiritually, I recently heard about someone walking away from me too quickly and that they didn't even understand how they'd feel emotionally when they did so because they were acting impulsive and reckless, which allowed them to feel in control but without processing their emotions. Apparently, that person is having a change of heart about things because the situation is making them feel a lot more differently than they thought it would because they blocked out the emotional reality of how it was making them feel. They initiated some type of no contact situation and I didn't chase them when they thought I would because they were only thinking of their fear of abandonment and they tried to convince themselves I needed them in order for them to try to deal with that fear. I'm hearing that person wants to come in and emotionally manipulate me into a reaction and a response because they're worried, they feel abandoned, and all they see is me walking away and they think I betrayed them. Apparently, I don't have the truth about how they're actually feeling about me. They think I'm leading them on. For some reason, it was said that I'm trying to make some kind of choice and decision, as if I haven't already constantly been trying extremely hard to demonstrate I've already made my decisions on what I want, as if they're not the indecisive one refusing to make a decision. Not sure if it's the same person, but apparently someone significant to this is also not sure why I'm being silent and not sure if I'm sad. What the hell? And apparently they want to talk to me. Well, where's the talking then? And I'm hearing they're not ready to give me what I deserve. Ugh. Looking at Kimmy's latest stream, Jamie decided not to stream her usual Sunday stream this Sunday, but Kimmy uncharacteristically did.
This seems like the perfect night to cozy up and shake off our Sunday scaries. Who here gets Sunday scaries? A little bit anxious anxiety and impending doom because of the news this past week, so I kind of just wanted to do ASMR. Enjoy some ASMR with people who enjoy ASMR. Remind myself that there's still faith in this world and humanity. What happened? Just, nothing to really worry ourselves over. Unless World War III happens, but like we're fine. We're fine. It's just like a lot. No, but I think my relationship with Snowball has been getting better too, because she doesn't we don't rely on each other for constant attention. So now I give her more space and she likes that, and she comes up to me more for affection. It's cute. Anyway, I'm sorry I keep yapping about my cats. I feel like once you own a cat, it becomes part of your personality. You just start talking about your cat like you're crazy, like they're another human being. I keep forgetting that, they're just cats, I swear. You love cat talk. I keep forgetting that nobody really cares about my cats. Well, not nobody. I'm sure some of you guys do, but I keep forgetting that the whole world doesn't love my cats. Would you ever do a roleplay ASMR, clinic or hairdresser? Ooh, I could do I might, as long as the roleplay is really realistic. I'm open to it. I'm just bad at fake, made up role plays, but I might be able to do a hair cutting role play. Chat, what is your favorite fruit?
Yet again, Kimmy framing her content as particularly intended to be comforting puts me in a difficult spot where I have to address it, but she's also trying to get away with supposedly comforting me, although in reality having entirely the opposite effect. She's talking about having anxiety and a feeling of impending doom, so clearly she recognizes her egregious disrespect and neglect towards me isn't something she should be so arrogantly fine with doing, yet she persists with it unapologetically and only continues to be enabled and facilitated by many, even despite my greatest efforts to stop getting attacked, as if I've been trying to do so myself, dumping all of her negative karma for it onto me entirely at my expense against my consent. Destroying my life and leaving me with hitmen coming after me gives Kimmy faith in humanity, while I'm left with increasingly diminishing reason to have any. Her recklessness is literally so extremely severe she herself is forced to recognize she's heading towards causing World War III, literally getting the entire goddamn world nuked, and yet she just downplays it with, "We're fine, it's just a lot." What the hell do you mean, it's just a lot? It's not fine. And of course, her damn cats get more love than I ever actually did from her. And instead of showing even the slightest bit of sincere empathy for me, she instead tries to throw pity parties for herself, trying to passive-aggressively guilt her audience for not making her feel like her cats are more important than they really are. How does she forget that the whole world doesn't revolve around her cats? Is that some weird, devious admittance of guilt that she's been terrorizing me and heading towards World War III because she feels like she can play God with my life because she has cats? That's definitely not okay. She said something weird about being willing to do roleplay as long as the roleplay is really realistic, probably further trying to extremely deviously, egregiously misrepresent me entirely at my expense against my consent, as doing roleplay that she's somehow now probably just trying to say is really realistic, as if I'm just pretending really realistically to somehow feel better about myself or something. Sickening. Absolutely disgusting. This is the real me, not some kind of really realistic role-playing, and I've never been trying to get her to be in a relationship with me that she feels is some kind of really realistic role-playing either. And now, again with the asking about favorite fruit. First it was Jamie, now it's Kimmy. Some extremely unhinged criminal trying to murder me seriously has some extremely unhealthy fixation with interrogating me about my favorite fruit. I didn't have to answer when Jamie asked, and I don't have to just because Kimmy asked either. Get real, psycho. Sober up. It's probably Celine that's doing it behind the scenes, if you ask me. Celine, you're seriously a massive scumbag for trying to play God with my life like this, and you seriously have massive mental health issues for believing Chloe ever had so much power over me that appeasing her energy by trying to set me up with an egregiously disgusting fake love offer would make you the ruler of the world. What's really becoming rather extremely painfully evident to me at this point is that I've had the meaning and practical applicable consequences of respect, love, and trust extremely egregiously misrepresented and perverted to mean very different things than I actually do, and such has most certainly been occurring entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent. As far as love, it's a little too easy to argue about perception and feelings to the extent that the rhetoric degrades into a largely, if not entirely meaningless back and forth about essentially unprovable intent. So it's hard for me to clearly identify exactly how various misconceptions of me in relation to it can be precisely diffused to produce results favorable to me. As far as trust, I myself am of the belief that those who tend to expect or demand trust you don't feel comfortable giving tend to be those that intend to abuse and exploit it maliciously, so I find it pointless to argue about. But respect? Well, there's a very good reason I've repeated countless times that I'm being disrespected, and not focus on complaints constantly about feeling a lack of being trusted or feeling loved. Let's give an easy-to-understand example. If you're a CEO of a company and you fire someone and say it's effective immediately, they are fired immediately, and that's that. Not after a year, not after a month, not after a week, not after 24 hours. Immediately. That's what respect looks like. You don't get endless different aggravating opinions you're forced to have to consider and address and constantly listen to excuses about and experience delays on your decisions because of, to absolutely no real benefit whatsoever to you. You actually get results. And especially if you gave them a fair opportunity to change behavior that made you want to fire them first, changes that were well within their capabilities if they really cared, and they utterly refused with egregious arrogance. Even if them getting fired means they literally die, you really don't have to care. I've never expected, and still don't expect, some kind of heavily oppressive, absolutely unconditional obedience from the entire world. I recognize that would be an expectation that builds resentment and wouldn't really be conducive of genuine connections. but respecting me was never intended to be seen and or treated as optional. If I communicate explicitly about matters, explicitly directly addressing individuals and objectively demonstrating my worthiness of recognition, respect, and a clear, explicit public and perhaps also private response, that was never intended to allow any room to be ignored, trivialized, dismissed, delayed, and or otherwise mitigated for me to receive what I'm pursuing and have objectively proven I deserve. I won't tolerate underhanded attempts to make it seem like I feel some kind of strange need to overcompensate for some perception of me being some kind of dictator by being a massive pushover and going through all these efforts with some kind of desire and or willingness to tolerate being trivialized or flat out ignored. From what I can tell, Chloe's literally trying to act like she deserves to effectively exert influence as if she's the literal ruler of the world by egregiously criminally falsifying narratives that I am, ever was, and or ever will be willing to relinquish the immense authority I carry and power that comes along with it in exchange for some extremely miserable, fake, garbage connection with her, where she's acting like I'm some horrible person who was always trying to ruin her life and Jerry's life and possibly also Herman's life, and break apart their trash relationship so I can have an effectively even more trash relationship with one or more of them at the cost of everything waiting for me if I fully cut them out of my life energetically, decisively, like I've been trying to do all along, and I'm sure they know I've been trying to do all along. I want it extremely clear. I'm fully willing to push Chloe into the destiny she has been trying to leave me trapped in, but that necessarily requires that I myself am first taken out of the environment that she must be put into to face that extremely negative karma she's been trying so extremely hard to avoid and shove onto me, fully consciously and intentionally, entirely unjustly at my expense against my consent. The only meaningful manner which I see that can come about is by being liberated from the egregious defamation and ongoing ostracization of me through Kimmy, Jamie, and Celine's basically proxy terrorism of me for Chloe. If they are unwilling to actually adequately make amends for the harm they've already done to me in a timely manner, they too should be treated as fully consciously and intentionally involved in conspiracy to murder me on a level equal to, or perhaps even greater than, Chloe herself. If I don't get a meaningful, explicit, public addressing of what I've been saying on this podcast by Kimmy in the near future, I see myself ending up suing not only the Canadian government but also the United States government if things continue how they have been. There are no other possible outcomes. Either things change in a manner I find favorable, as I deserve, or things should only get increasingly severe for such clearly, egregiously, unapologetically harmful influences I only increasingly irrefutably demonstrate as being as such with every passing day as things have been happening. I'm only finding it increasingly disturbing that I've been left having to extremely meticulously elaborate on so many personal details of my life in public in order to ever even possibly have the chance to be seen as at all even remotely worthy of any semblance of actual respect and decency from anyone I've ever actually felt close to or wanted recognition from. I can't even really try to begin building a business in my video game development endeavors I've been forcefully held in more or less complete stagnation of for an extremely painfully long period of time, and still to this day. Like I've been saying countless times that I have absolutely no desire and or willingness to have children or be a parent, even to adopted children, yet I'm having to present my perspective on how to be a good parent instead of having any time or energy to actually start a business for myself without some cheap AI exploitation I'm entirely uninterested in engaging in. What the hell? I've already irrefutably proven that nobody should be listening to or believing any assertions not extremely clearly proven with irrefutable evidence from anyone from my past. Yet I continue to see, even spiritually, indications that defamation I'm facing from those scumbags continues to terrorize my life with what is undoubtedly unsubstantiated, egregious defamation. And clearly, Kimmy and her associates are all too happy to add on to it while they continue to treat me as if that unsubstantiated, egregious defamation is truth rather than the substance to my personality I've irrefutably demonstrated with this podcast. I have provided extensive evidence of multiple serious crimes being committed against me by multiple individuals from different groups, both online and offline, and yet I continue not to receive any meaningful contact from any kind of government agent providing me any kind of clarity on anything. I've never looked up to anyone from my past nor anyone on my mailing list as any kind of mentor or a teacher of some kind, even if there may have been times where I ended up somehow learning something from them. No amount of resistance to my position is going to make me suddenly see anyone from my past or any of these celebrities as some kind of mentor to me. If I'm going to look at someone for inspiration of some kind and try to set goals for my greatness, I'll look at billionaires and other world leaders, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and even then, I'd look at them with intense scrutiny and only try to learn from their good qualities and discard negative qualities. If I'm going to look up to someone, I'm not going to look up to some attention-obsessed, validation-addicted, deeply mentally ill wannabe billionaires like Kimmy and her friends, or the complete losers that I once called family and friends in closer physical proximity to me.